Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this, I don't know, this comforting expectation of precision, right?
Yeah.
It feels like engineering. Like you break your arm, you go to the hospital, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is, that's the problem.
Yeah, exactly. It's binary. It's either broken or it's not. We really like things to be visible and easily categorized because it just makes the solution so obvious. Put a cast on it and you're basically done.
Right. But then you step into the world of economics, and suddenly that pristine x-ray machine is just, it's completely shattered. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, honestly, incredibly murky. I mean, if you turn on the news right now, you're going to hear these terms thrown around with absolute certainty.
Oh, constantly. Inflation, supply side, marginal utility.
Keynesian stimulus?
Yeah, people use them as if they're these hard, immutable laws of physics. But when you actually try to, look under the hood at the engines driving those concepts, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And there is a very specific reason for that murkiness, actually. Economics isn't just about math, and it isn't just about money, even though it's, constantly disguised as such with all those complex charts and equations. At its absolute core, economics is the study of human behavior.
Human behavior.
Yeah, it's the study of our choices, our psychology, our fears, and ultimately our survival. It's about how we as a species allocate these incredibly scarce resources in a world where, frankly, we just cannot have everything we want.
Which brings us perfectly to our mission for you today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are going to map the entire landscape of human economic thought.
The whole thing.
The whole thing. And we are using an incredible source to guide us through this. There's this fantastic breakdown by the YouTube channel Adam's Axiom, and it's titled, Every Major Economic Theory Explained in 20 Minutes. And our goal today is to take that framework and really expand on it, to shortcut your way to being economically fluent.
Right. We want to give you the tools to actually understand the news, to understand your paycheck, the world around you, but without drowning you in all that overwhelming jargon.
Exactly. The jargon is usually just a huge barrier. So we're going to stretch out the timeline of history, walking you through the entire evolution of how humanity has tried to understand the exchange of value.
And what's truly fascinating as we take this journey is that we're essentially tracing the evolution of human society itself. I mean, we are going to move from a world of kings and agrarian peasants straight into the smoke and grit of the Industrial Revolution and push right up to the modern, hyper-interconnected digital global economy.
It's a massive shift.
It is. Because, none of these economic theories were developed in a vacuum. Every single one of them was a desperate attempt to solve a specific, terrifying crisis of their own specific time.
Now, before we take that first step, there is a crucial disclaimer we really need to lay out for you.
Yeah.
Because as we pull apart these different eras of thought, we're going to be touching on some incredibly debated, highly politically charged theories.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we're going to be talking about Marxism, we're going to be talking about supply side, trickle-down economics, and I want to assure you right now that we are taking absolutely zero sides today.
Zero. Our role is simply to act as your guides through this museum of economic history. We are going to impartially unpack the mechanical logic of each theory exactly as its original architects built it right from the source material.
Yeah, we want to show you how these thinkers constructed their arguments. We aren't endorsing the viewpoints at all. We're just rolling out the blueprint so you can see, how the buildings stay up.
So let's look at the very first blueprint. We have to rewind the clock back to the 18th century.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. This is the birth of classical economics. We're looking at an era where thinkers are just starting to view the economy not as like the personal piggy bank of a king, but as a massive interlocking machine. And according to this foundational theory, this machine runs best when you just step back and leave it completely alone.
The defining moment here happens in 1776. Now, that's a massive year for global history, obviously, but in the economic realm, it's the year Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations.
Right, the granddaddy of them all.
Yeah. Adam Smith is universally recognized as the grandfather of modern economics, and he introduced a concept that has dominated the conversation ever since: the invisible hand.
The invisible hand. It sounds almost mystical, doesn't it? Like some sort of economic ghost.
It really does. But when you break it down, it's actually a deeply grounded, almost cynical idea about human self-interest. Like, think about a baker in a small 18th century town.
Okay, a baker.
Yeah. When that baker wakes up at 4 in the morning, starts a fire, begins kneading dough,
Yeah.
they are not doing it out of a deep altruistic love for humanity. They aren't thinking, oh, I must ensure that society gets its daily calories.
Not at all. I mean, they're doing it for one reason: to make money. They want profit to feed their own family. They are pursuing their own very narrow personal self-interest.
Right. But this is the absolute genius of Adam Smith's observation. In that selfish pursuit of profit, the baker inadvertently ensures that the people in their town get their daily bread.
Yeah, it's wild.
You have millions of people across the country all acting selfishly, all trying to maximize their own wealth, and yet, unknowingly, they create a highly ordered, perfectly functioning system that provides for everyone.
It is a staggering realization when you sit with it. The baker wants money, so they make bread. You, the consumer, are hungry, so you buy the bread. There is no central committee, no royal decree, no government planner dictating that a certain amount of wheat must be harvested and milled and baked.
The invisible hand just coordinates that entire unimaginably complex supply chain automatically. And the classical economists believed that this machine naturally adjusts itself through a beautifully simple mechanism, prices and wages.
Let's stay in that town and look at the mechanics of those prices. So let's say a drought hits. Wheat is scarce, and suddenly bread becomes very expensive because everyone still needs to eat, but there's just less bread to go around.
Okay, so the baker hikes the price.
Right. What happens next? Other people in the town look at our baker and say, wow, the baker is charging a premium and getting rich. I want to get rich too. So maybe the blacksmith's son or the carpenter decides to open a competing bakery.
Oh, I see. The high price acts as, like, a flare in the night sky. It signals to the rest of the market that there's profit to be made here.
Exactly. Which means the supply of bread goes up as new bakers enter the market. And the moment that supply goes up, the power dynamic shifts.
Because now the consumer has choices.
Right. Because if the first baker tries to keep their prices sky high, the new baker will just undercut them to steal the customers, so the price naturally has to come down. The system self-corrects without anyone passing a law about the price of bread.
And Adam Smith argued the exact same logic applies to human labor, right?
Yeah.
To wages.
Yes, absolutely. If blacksmiths are suddenly making incredibly high wages because horseshoes are in massive demand, workers in other professions will notice. They'll drop their plows, learn to use a hammer, and flock to become blacksmiths. That massive influx of new labor increases the supply of blacksmiths, which eventually brings their wages back down to a normal equilibrium.
It's an elegant, entirely self-balancing equation. But, the classical thinkers didn't just stop at the borders of a single town. They scaled this up to look at how entire nations interact. And this is where we bring in David Ricardo and his theory of comparative advantage.
Oh, this is a big one.
It really is. Now, I want to spend a minute here because this is a concept from the source material that often trips people up, but it is the foundational logic for all modern global trade. So the classic scenario involves two nations. Let's use England and Portugal.
Okay, this is a vital piece of the classical puzzle. Let's imagine both England and Portugal produce two primary goods: cloth and wine.
Cloth and wine. Got it.
Now, let's stack the deck and imagine England is just an absolute, unstoppable economic powerhouse. They have better technology, faster workers, better resources. They are mathematically better and faster than Portugal at making both cloth and wine.
Okay, so intuitively, if you're sitting in London, your gut reaction is, we don't need to trade with Portugal at all. We're better at everything. We should just make all our own cloth and all our own wine.
Right. Why buy inferior goods or goods that take longer to make from someone else? It feels like you're just subsidizing a weaker economy.
Exactly.
But Ricardo pointed out a profound mathematical truth about opportunity cost. Let's look closer. Yes, England is better at both. But maybe they are magnitudes better at making cloth, thanks to their massive textile mills, but only slightly better at making wine because, their climate isn't great for grapes.
Right.
Ricardo argued that every hour an English worker spends trying to grow grapes and make wine is an hour they are not spending running those highly efficient textile looms.
So the true cost of making wine isn't just the grapes. It's the massive amount of cloth you sacrificed by pulling your best workers away from the machines.
Precisely. Therefore, Ricardo mathematically proved that both countries end up richer if England puts 100% of its energy, all its workers, and all its capital into what it is relatively best at: cloth. They maximize their total wealth creation.
Meanwhile, they let Portugal focus entirely on wine.
Yes, even if Portugal is a bit slower at making wine than England, it is still their most efficient use of their own labor. Then the two nations trade. England gets more wine than they could have produced themselves with the same labor, and Portugal gets more cloth.
Wow. So it's not about absolute dominance, it's about relative efficiency. You maximize your strengths, you don't dabble in your weaknesses.
Exactly.
And when you combine Ricardo's global trade with Adam Smith's invisible hand, you arrive at the ultimate conclusion, the overarching motto of the entire classical era, laissez-faire. Let it be.
Do not touch the machine.
Because if this machine is self-correcting, if prices naturally find their balance, and if trade naturally optimizes the wealth of nations, then the absolute worst thing you can possibly do is to introduce government interference.
To a classical economist, things like tariffs on foreign goods or price controls, like a king declaring that bread can only cost 1 copper coin regardless of the wheat harvest, these aren't helpful protections for the poor. They are literally throwing a wrench into the gears of a perfectly tuned engine. It disrupts the natural signals of the market.
Okay, let me see if I can put an analogy to this to really lock it in for you.
Yeah.
Classical economics basically treats the economy like a sprawling, self-regulating forest ecosystem.
Yeah.
The sunlight, the rain, the plants, the animals, they all balance each other out naturally.
Right.
If there are too many rabbits one year, they eat too much vegetation. But that boom in rabbits causes the wolf population to grow, which brings the rabbit population back down, which allows the vegetation to recover. It's a continuous, harmonious dance. You don't need a park ranger out there manually feeding the wolves or planting the grass.
Yeah. That captures the sentiment perfectly. It's a deep belief in a natural, spontaneous harmony.
And here is the massive pivot. If we take that exact same forest and look at it through a completely different lens, the picture changes entirely. We are going to move forward in time to the middle of the 19th century, deep into the Industrial Revolution, and we meet Karl Marx.
And Marx looks at this so-called harmonious machine, and he doesn't see a machine at all.
No, he sees a brutal, blood-soaked battlefield. When he looks at the forest, he doesn't see a balanced ecosystem. He only sees the predators tearing apart the prey.
Yeah, Marxian economics is a violent, radical departure from everything Adam Smith built. You have to understand the context here. Smith was writing at the dawn of the capitalist era, looking at small shopkeepers and bakers.
Okay.
Marx was writing decades later in the thick of the industrial explosion. He was looking at massive, dangerous factories. He saw cities choked with smog, children working grueling 14-hour days, and the extreme, crushing poverty of the working class living mere blocks away from the unimaginable opulence of the factory owners.
It's a totally different world.
Completely. Marx wasn't proposing a polite academic tweak to the models. He was diagnosing what he viewed as a terminal disease embedded inside capitalism itself.
And the absolute beating heart of his diagnosis is something called the labor theory of value. If we want to understand Marxism economically, we really have to understand this mechanic.
Right.
It is the idea that the true fundamental value of any product comes exclusively from the human labor, the sweat, the muscle, and the time that was put into making it.
Let's walk through a concrete example from the breakdown to see exactly how Marx calculated this. Picture a worker in one of these 19th century factories making wooden chairs.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
This worker clocks in for a grueling 8-hour shift. In those 8 hours, they use their physical labor, their learned skill, and their energy to build 10 wooden chairs from raw lumber. Now, at the end of the day, the factory owner takes those 10 chairs and sells them to the public for $50 each.
So 10 chairs sold at $50 a piece. That means the worker just generated $500 of total value in that single shift.
Exactly. But what does the worker actually take home? What is their wage for that day of backbreaking labor? Let's say the owner pays them $80.
$80.
Marx looks at this specific transaction and points a finger right at the math. He asks, if the worker's physical labor created $500 worth of new value in the world, why are they only walking away with $80?
Where did the other $420 go?
And the answer, obviously, is that it went straight into the vault of the factory owner. Marx had a specific term for this missing money. He called that remaining $420 the surplus value.
Surplus value.
Yes. And to Marx, this wasn't just a clever business margin. It was literal theft. It is profit that has been extracted directly from the worker's life energy.
This is the core engine of Marx's concept of exploitation. In his view, the capitalists, the people who own the factories, the looms, the tools, they are not growing wealthy because of their own hard work.
No, not at all.
They aren't wealthy because they took a clever risk or because they are brilliant innovators. They're growing wealthy specifically and only by pocketing the surplus value generated by the workers who actually make the things. The owner is essentially a parasite attached to the labor of the working class.
And what I find so striking about this is that Marx didn't view this as a flaw in a few bad, greedy factories. He didn't think we just needed better labor laws or nicer bosses. He saw this exploitation as the foundational architecture of capitalism.
It wasn't a bug in the software.
No, as the operating system itself. Capitalism requires the continuous extraction of surplus value to survive. Because if the owner pays the worker the full $500 they created, there's no profit, and the capitalist system ceases to exist.
Right. And because this extraction is mandatory for the system to function, Marx viewed this dynamic like a giant societal pressure cooker continuously building steam. He believed this systemic exploitation would inevitably, mathematically lead to a breaking point.
The owners would keep pushing wages down to increase their surplus, and the workers would eventually be squeezed into utter destitution. Which brings us to his grand theory of historical materialism.
Okay, let's unpack this. This is the idea that economic systems are not permanent, right? They are just temporary stages of human history that naturally evolve and collapse based on these internal class conflicts.
Exactly. Just as the ancient world of masters and slaves collapsed, and just as the medieval system of lords and peasants feudalism eventually gave way and evolved into capitalism, Marx predicted that capitalism was doomed.
It would collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions.
The pressure cooker would explode, the working class, the proletariat would realize they outnumbered the owners, they would seize the factories, and they would violently overthrow the system.
And this revolution, according to Marx, would usher in socialism, where the workers owned the means of production and eventually settled into a stateless, classless society known as communism.
It is a massive, sweeping, almost prophetic vision of human history.
It really is. But when I look at both the classical economist and Marx, I notice something. They are both looking at these massive society-wide forces.
They are.
They're looking at broad, sweeping classes of people, well, working class, the capitalist class, the landowners. They're standing on top of a mountain looking at the macro trends of humanity. But how on earth did the field of economics move from looking at these giant social classes down to trying to figure out how you, the individual listener, decides whether to buy a cup of coffee or save your money?
That shift in perspective is perhaps the biggest revolution in the history of the field. To understand value better than just broadly defining it as social labor, economists realized they needed to put down the telescope and pick up a microscope.
Zooming way in.
Exactly. They had to move away from the macro level of entire social classes and get down to the absolute micro level, a single individual human mind making a choice in a specific moment in time.
Which brings us to the late 19th century, and an era that completely rewrites the rulebook. The economists of this time take a look at Marx's labor theory of value, and they completely throw it in the trash.
They really did.
They introduced neoclassical economics, and this completely revolutionizes how we think about value, price, and human desire.
The neoclassical thinkers introduced a concept called marginalism. They argued that value does not come from how much labor went into a product. Labor is irrelevant to the consumer.
Irrelevant.
Yes. Value comes entirely from the additional satisfaction you get from consuming one more unit of that product at any given moment.
It makes value entirely subjective. It's not an objective fact built into the chair or the bread. It's an experience happening inside the consumer's brain.
Exactly.
And there was a brilliant, universally understood way to illustrate this from the video. I want you, the listener, to imagine you are ordering a pizza.
Oh, it is the absolute best way to understand marginal utility. Imagine you haven't eaten all day. You are starving. The delivery driver arrives, you open the box, and you take that very first slice of pizza. Think about how amazing that tastes.
The best thing ever.
The satisfaction, the utility you get from that first slice is astronomically high. You would probably be willing to pay $10 or $15 just for that single slice in that moment of intense hunger.
The value of that slice is peaking. But then you keep eating. You get to your fourth slice. Now, it still tastes like pizza. It's still good, but you aren't starving anymore. Your stomach is getting full.
Right.
The additional satisfaction, the marginal utility of that fourth slice is way lower than the first slice. You wouldn't pay $15 for it now. Maybe you'd only pay $2.
And if you keep going and you push yourself to eat the eighth slice, you are completely stuffed. You are uncomfortable. The marginal utility hasn't just dropped to zero. It has actually become negative.
Negative util.
Yeah, eating that eighth slice actively makes your life worse. As a rational person, you might actually pay someone $1 to take that eighth slice away from you so you don't feel obligated to finish it.
So if we look at this through Marx's lens, the chef put the exact same amount of labor into the first slice as they did into the eighth slice. The labor is identical.
But neoclassical economics shows us that the value of the slice changed dramatically. The value is entirely dependent on the subjective state of the consumer.
And this concept of diminishing marginal utility actually solves one of the oldest, most frustrating mysteries in economics, known as the diamond-water paradox.
Oh, this was a puzzle that completely stumped Adam Smith and the early thinkers. The paradox is simple. Water is absolutely essential for human life. We die in a matter of days without it.
Yeah,
Diamonds, on the other hand, are completely non-essential. They're just shiny, compressed carbon. You can live your entire life without ever seeing one. So why is water, the substance of life, incredibly cheap, while diamonds are outrageously expensive?
yeah, if value was just about human need or usefulness, a glass of water should cost a fortune.
But marginalism explains it perfectly. We don't value things in total. We value them at the margin.
At the margin.
Because water is generally so abundant on Earth, most of us already have enough for survival, for bathing, for washing our clothes. So the marginal utility of acquiring one additional glass of water is basically zero. We won't pay anything for one more drop.
But diamonds are exceedingly rare.
Exactly. Most people have very few of them, if any. Therefore, the marginal utility of acquiring just one additional diamond is incredibly high, which drives the market price up.
It's a brilliant shift in how we view the world. Neoclassical economics essentially views you, me, and everyone listening as these highly rational calculating machines. We're constantly walking around looking at our limited resources, our time and our money, and we are constantly doing internal math to maximize our satisfaction or our utility.
Will this $5 coffee give me more utility than saving the $5 for a movie ticket?
Right. And it assumes the exact same rationality for businesses. While consumers are rationally calculating how to maximize their utility, businesses are rationally calculating how to maximize their profits by producing exactly what consumers want. Prices become the vital communication signals that coordinate this incredibly elaborate dance between millions of rational actors.
It creates this complex, beautiful web of supply and demand curves. It's like an intricate mobile hanging from a ceiling, always seeking that perfect point of balance, that equilibrium. And to make their mathematical models work flawlessly, the neoclassicals introduced this theoretical benchmark called perfect competition.
Perfect competition.
Perfect competition is essentially an economic utopia. It envisions a market where there are hundreds of small firms, all competing fairly, all selling the exact same identical product. Crucially, it assumes that you, the consumer, have complete perfect information. You magically know the price of every single product in every single store at all times.
Which is crazy.
And it assumes there are zero barriers for new businesses to enter the market if they see an opportunity.
Now, obviously, that utopian state rarely, if ever, exists in the messy, real world. You never have perfect information when you buy a used car. You don't know the profit margins of your local grocery store. But it serves as a crucial benchmark. It gives economists a theoretical ideal to measure real markets against.
It's a very neat, mathematically satisfying way to look at the world. It provides a comforting equation. If everyone just acts rationally in their own self-interest, the market will continuously find a perfect equilibrium.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Let's pull on this thread for a second. If value is totally subjective, based on how hungry I am for that eighth slice of pizza, how can a market ever perfectly coordinate?
Because your choices aren't happening in a vacuum.
Exactly. My choices affect your choices. If I buy the last slice of pizza, you go hungry. It sounds like we aren't just calculating our own desires in isolation. We are constantly having to guess what the other person is going to do. And if their choice impacts my outcome, the math gets infinitely more complicated.
And that realization is exactly what shatters the neat little snow globe of perfect competition. It leads us directly into a field of study that changes everything: game theory.
Game theory.
If neoclassical economics sees the market as a serene, self-balancing math equation, game theory sees the economy as a giant, high-stakes, deeply paranoid chessboard.
Game theory was primarily developed by the brilliant mathematician John von Neumann and later revolutionized by John Nash, the mathematician portrayed by Russell Crowe in the movie A Beautiful Mind.
Right.
Game theory asks a terrifyingly simple question. How do perfectly rational people behave when their success depends entirely on the choices that other rational people make?
It is no longer just about maximizing your own utility in a vacuum. To truly understand this, we have to put you, the listener, into the most famous scenario in all of game theory, the prisoner's dilemma.
I want you to vividly imagine this.
Yeah.
You and a partner have just committed a major corporate crime, say massive fraud. The FBI catches you, but their evidence is a little thin.
Oh.
They bring you both into headquarters and put you in two separate interrogation rooms. Concrete walls, steel tables. You cannot communicate with your partner. A detective walks into your room and offers you a deal. And they're offering your partner the exact same deal in the other room. You have two choices. You can stay silent and cooperate with your partner, or you can betray your partner and confess to everything.
Let's map out the exact matrix of possibilities, because the map here is a trap. Scenario 1, if you both stay silent, if you trust each other, the FBI doesn't have enough evidence for the major fraud charge. They can only get you on a minor tax evasion charge. You both get a light sentence of 1 year in prison.
Okay, 1 year. That is clearly the best combined outcome for the two of you as a team.
Scenario 2, if you both choose to betray each other and confess, the FBI has all the evidence they need. You both get convicted of the major crime, but because you cooperated with the FBI, they cut you a slight deal. You each get 3 years in prison.
Okay, so mutual silence gets 1 year. Mutual betrayal gets 3 years. But here is where the psychological trap snaps shut. What happens if you stay silent, but your partner betrays you?
If you nobly stay silent, but your partner sings to the FBI, your partner is granted full immunity. They walk out the front door free, 0 years. Meanwhile, you take the absolute maximum punishment for refusing to cooperate. You get slammed with 5 years in prison.
5 years.
And of course, the reverse is true. If you betray them and they stay silent, you go free and they get 5 years.
So you are sitting in that cold interrogation room alone. You are a perfectly rational actor, just like the neoclassical economists assume you are. You run the calculations. You think, okay, what if my partner stays silent? If they're silent, I can stay silent and get 1 year, or I can betray them and go completely free. 0 is better than 1, so my rational move is to betray.
Then you run the other calculation. What if my partner has already betrayed me? If they betrayed me, I can stay silent and get 5 years, or I can betray them too and get 3 years. 3 is better than 5, so my rational move is still to betray.
No matter what your partner does, whether they're a saint or a snake, your most rational, mathematically sound, self-interested choice is always to betray them.
But here is the devastating twist that broke economic theory. Because your partner is also a perfectly rational actor sitting in their own room, they run the exact same math. They also choose to betray.
Oh, man.
And because you both acted in perfectly rational self-interest, you both end up serving 3 years in prison. You end up far worse off than if you had just irrationally trusted each other and stayed silent to get the 1 year sentence.
This is the tragedy of rational self-interest. The prisoner's dilemma mathematically proves that when individuals ruthlessly pursue their own selfish desires, it can actually lead to the absolute worst possible outcome for everyone involved.
It completely undercuts Adam Smith's invisible hand. Smith said selfish behavior naturally leads to a good outcome for society. Game theory says, actually, sometimes selfish behavior locks society into a downward spiral where everyone loses.
And this isn't just a parlor trick for detectives. This simple game explains so much of the destructive behavior in our world. Think about the nuclear arms race during the Cold War.
Oh, perfect example.
Both the US and the USSR would have been safer and richer if they both stopped building nukes, which is mutual silence. But if one stopped and the other kept building, the one who stopped risked annihilation, the 5-year sentence. So the rational move for both was to spend trillions building world-ending weapons. Mutual betrayal.
It perfectly explains climate change, too. Imagine every country in the world is a prisoner in this game. Everyone agrees we would all be better off reducing carbon emissions to avoid a climate catastrophe. That's the mutual 1-year sentence. But every individual country has a massive economic incentive to secretly keep bringing cheap coal while everyone else cuts back, giving their factories a massive competitive edge. That's the temptation to betray and go free.
So what happens? Nations drag their feet, they point fingers, they rationally choose to keep polluting, and the whole world suffers the catastrophic outcome.
And John Nash's biggest contribution to this field was proving that in any complex system with multiple players, there is always at least one point where the system gets stuck. It's a point where no single player can benefit by changing their strategy all by themselves, even if the overall outcome is bad. This is known as the Nash equilibrium.
Let's bring this down to a daily experience. Think about driving in traffic.
Yeah.
In America, everyone drives on the right side of the road. We don't do this because the right side is inherently scientifically better or more efficient than the left side. We do it simply because everyone else is doing it.
Exactly. If you wake up tomorrow and decide, I am going to maximize my utility by driving on the left side of the road today, changing your strategy alone would be disastrous.
You'd cause a massive head-on collision.
Yes. Your success depends entirely on conforming to the choices of others. You are locked into the strategy. That is a Nash equilibrium.
So if we look at where we are in our journey, we have these beautiful, intricate neoclassical models of supply and demand theoretically seeking balance. And we have the intense, paranoid, strategic logic of game theory mapping our choices. But what happens when the entire perfectly competitive system suddenly, violently, and inexplicably stops working in the real world?
Yeah. What happens when equilibrium just vanishes and the market can't find its way back?
That brings us crashing into the 1930s and the cataclysm of the Great Depression. This was an economic trauma that just broke the brains of the classical economists.
The Great Depression shattered the fundamental assumption that markets will always fix themselves if you just wait long enough. Unemployment skyrocketed to 25%, thousands of banks failed, businesses collapsed, and the economy didn't bounce back. It didn't self-correct. It just stayed broken year after brutal year.
The machine was stalled out and people were starving. This crisis required a radical new vision. And in 1936, a British economist named John Maynard Keynes stepped onto the stage and offered one. His message was fundamentally a rejection of laissez-faire. He basically said, sometimes the invisible hand is paralyzed, and if you leave it alone, it will die. It needs a massive external push.
Keynes completely flipped economic thinking on its head. Before Keynes, economists mostly focused on the supply side, the production of goods, the factories, the workers.
Right.
Keynes looked at the Great Depression and said, the problem isn't that we forgot how to produce things. The factories are still sitting there. The workers are still standing outside willing to work. The problem is a total collapse of demand. He focused his entire theory on aggregate demand, which is the total amount of spending happening in an entire economy at a given time.
And he identified a terrifying psychological trap that happens during a severe recession. Put yourself in the shoes of someone living in 1931. You see your neighbors losing their jobs. You see banks locking their doors. You get scared.
That is a deeply natural, rational human reaction.
So what do you do when you are terrified about losing your income next month? You stop spending money. You cancel your vacation. You stop buying new clothes. And you hoard every penny you can in a jar under your bed.
And businesses do the exact same thing. A factory owner sees the dark clouds gathering, so they cancel their plans to build a new warehouse, they stop buying new machinery, and they lay off workers to hoard cash. Keynes coined a brilliant term for this phenomenon, the paradox of thrift.
The paradox of thrift. This is such a crucial concept to grasp. Let's break down the mechanics of the paradox. If I am worried about a recession, it is incredibly smart and responsible for me individually to stop going out to restaurants and save my money. It is a rational choice to protect my family.
It is entirely rational for you as an individual, but the paradox is that what is smart for the individual becomes absolutely disastrous for the collective economy when millions of people do it at the exact same time.
Because my spending is someone else's income.
Yeah.
If I don't go to the diner owner doesn't make money. So, to survive, the owner lays off a waiter. Now that waiter has zero income, so they can't afford to buy groceries. The grocery store loses money, so they cancel an order from the local farmer.
It creates a violent, self-fulfilling downward spiral. When everyone saves at once out of fear, total spending aggregate demand plummets. The economy contracts rapidly.
And seeing this contraction makes people even more terrified.
Exactly. So they save even more aggressively, which causes more layoffs, and the spiral accelerates toward the bottom. The free market cannot fix itself because fear has paralyzed the very mechanism of exchange.
So if consumers are too scared to spend and businesses are too terrified to invest, who is left to break the cycle? Who has a wallet big enough and a mandate broad enough to step in and stop the spiral?
Keynes said there is only one entity, the government.
Yes. Keynes argued that during a severe economic depression, the government must become the spender of last resort. It must forcibly inject aggregate demand into the system.
If the private sector is paralyzed by fear, the public sector must step in with overwhelming force. The government needs to borrow massive amounts of money and spend it immediately.
Build bridges.
Build highways, build massive hydroelectric dams, hire millions of unemployed workers, cut taxes, do whatever it takes to get cash flowing through the frozen pipes of the economy again.
And he argued that this massive government spending is uniquely powerful because of a mathematical chain reaction called the multiplier effect. The idea is that when the government spends $1, it actually creates much more than $1 worth of economic activity. Let's trace the path of that dollar.
Let's follow the money.
All right.
The government decides to borrow money to build a new bridge. They hire an unemployed construction worker and pay him a wage of $50.
Okay.
That worker, who hasn't had an income in months, immediately takes that paycheck and goes to the local grocery store to buy food, winter coats for his kids, and maybe a small luxury like a radio.
The grocery store owner takes the profit from that sudden rush of sales and realizes he needs to upgrade his shop. So he buys a new cash register from a local supplier. The supplier uses that sudden influx of cash to hire a delivery driver.
The single dollar the government spent on the construction worker didn't just stop in his pocket. It bounced from the worker to the grocer to the supplier to the driver, multiplying the economic activity at every stop.
This was Keynes' most revolutionary and, to some, most dangerous idea. He fundamentally argued that in a depression, thrift, the act of saving money, is not a virtue. It is the core of the disease. Trying to save your way out of a severe recession to Keynes was like trying to cure a starving man by putting him on a strict diet. It might be a good habit in normal, healthy times, but in a crisis, it will literally kill the patient.
Right.
Okay, so Keynes is the mechanic standing over the stalled engine of the economy, saying, we need to hook this up to a massive battery pack of government spending and jumpstart the car.
Right.
As you can imagine, there was an entire school of thought that looked at this idea of massive government intervention and was absolutely horrified. This brings us to the fierce rivals of Keynes, the Austrian School of Economics.
Founded by Karl Menger and heavily developed by brilliant scholars like Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, the Austrians completely rejected the Keynesian premise.
They hated it.
They looked at the massive mathematical models of aggregate demand being built by Keynes and said, you are entirely missing the point of what an economy is. To them, economics is not about math equations, and it certainly isn't a plumbing system you can just pump money into. Economics is the study of human action.
They had a completely different, almost reverse explanation for why these devastating economic crashes happen in the first place. Keynes blamed a sudden, irrational lack of consumer demand. The Austrians pointed the finger directly at the very people Keynes wanted to empower, the central banks and the government.
The Austrians formulated a theory of the business cycle that argues recessions are actually the inevitable, painful hangover from a previous period of artificial government-induced euphoria. And who creates that artificial euphoria? Central banks, when they manipulate the money supply to keep interest rates artificially low.
Let's clarify the mechanics of this because it's vital. When a central bank lowers interest rates, it means borrowing money becomes incredibly cheap. If you are a business, taking out a loan suddenly costs almost nothing in interest. The Austrians described this injection of cheap, easy money as giving the entire economy a massive systemic sugar rush.
Exactly, a sugar rush. Imagine a housing developer. They see that they can borrow millions of dollars at a 1% interest rate. Because the money is so cheap, projects that used to look too risky suddenly look wildly profitable.
So they embark on massive, ambitious projects.
Right. They build 5 new subdivisions, they hire hundreds of construction crews, they buy up all the lumber. The economy looks like it's booming. Everyone is working.
But the Austrians argue this boom is an illusion. It is built on a lie. In a natural free market, interest rates are supposed to be a signal.
A vital signal.
Low interest rates are supposed to signal that society has saved up a ton of real wealth and is ready to buy all those new houses. But in this scenario, society hasn't actually saved any money. The central bank just printed cheap paper money and handed it out.
The price signals are fake. The artificially low interest rate is actively lying to the developer. So the developer and thousands of other businesses engage in what the Austrians call malinvestment. They overinvest in massive projects that don't actually have real underlying consumer demand or real savings backing them up.
And eventually, reality always reasserts itself. The sugar rush wears off. Inflation starts creeping up because there's too much money in the system, and the central bank panics and is forced to raise interest rates back to normal levels.
And suddenly, the developer looks at their ledger and realizes they can't afford the higher interest payments, and nobody actually has the savings to buy the houses they built. The ambitious projects are revealed to be massive, unprofitable mistakes.
And that is when the crash happens. The businesses fail, the half-built houses are abandoned, workers are laid off in droves, and the economy spirals into a recession.
So if you follow the Austrian logic, the recession itself isn't the disease. The recession is actually the harsh, necessary cure.
Wow, the cure.
It is the painful process of the economy flushing out all the bad, debt-fueled investments created by the cheap money, returning the system to reality.
Which means they look at the Keynesian solution of printing more money and spending aggressively to stop the recession as absolute madness. If the recession is the necessary hangover from a binge of cheap credit, then the Keynesian response is like trying to cure that hangover by drinking a bottle of tequila for breakfast.
You might numb the pain temporarily, but you are just setting up an even bigger, more catastrophic crash down the line. You are preventing the necessary healing process.
The Austrians were also famous for their intense philosophical critique of central planning. Friedrich Hayek argued that it is literally impossible, practically and mathematically, for a government or a committee of central planners to ever gather enough information to efficiently run an economy.
The information problem is central to Austrian thought. Think about something as simple as providing breakfast for a medium-sized city.
Just breakfast.
Just breakfast. Millions of people wake up every morning. Some want scrambled eggs, some want oatmeal, some want avocado toast. The amount of hyper-localized, constantly changing knowledge required to know exactly how many chickens need to lay eggs, how much wheat needs to be harvested in the Midwest, how many trucks are needed to ship it, and exactly which grocery aisles it all needs to be in by 7:00 a.m. tomorrow. It's a staggering, impossible computational problem. No group of elite bureaucrats sitting in a capital city could ever manage it without massive shortages or massive waste.
But the free market solves this impossible problem automatically, every single day, without anyone being in charge. How? Through the price system. To an Austrian, prices aren't just numbers on a tag. They are dense packets of crucial information.
Let's say a sudden frost kills half the orange crop in Florida. A central planner would panic, but the free market just adjusts the price. The price of orange juice shoots up.
That higher price instantly signals to consumers, hey, oranges are scarce, maybe buy apple juice instead.
And it simultaneously signals to growers in California, hey, orange juice is highly profitable right now. Ship your oranges east.
It creates what the Austrians call a spontaneous order, a complex functional system that emerges from the bottom up. To the Austrians, individual economic freedom isn't just a nice political preference. It is an absolute necessity for survival. The economy is far too complex, too organic, to be managed top-down by politicians acting like engineers.
It is such a stark contrast.
Keynes is the mechanic holding the jumper cable, saying we have to shock the stalled car to save it. The Austrians are sitting in the passenger seat yelling that the mechanic broke the car by messing with the fuel gauge in the first place, and the only way to fix it is to take his hands completely off the machinery.
It remains one of the most profound philosophical divides about the role of the state in human affairs.
But I have to ask you this. If Keynesian economics is all about boosting demand, what happens when boosting demand doesn't work? Because historically, Keynesian economics won that battle, right? After the Great Depression and World War II, Keynesianism became the absolute dominant theory for decades. Governments everywhere were managing aggregate demand.
And that worked until it didn't, which brings us to the counter-revolution. The Keynesian consensus ruled the post-war era, but in the 1970s, it drove straight into a brick wall. The global economy experienced a bizarre, terrifying phenomenon that Keynesian mathematical models struggled to even compute. It was called stagflation.
Stagflation. This is basically an economic nightmare scenario. It is a combination of two words, stagnation and inflation. It means the economy is stagnating, growth is dead, businesses are closing, and unemployment is high. But simultaneously, inflation is spiraling completely out of control. The cost of living is skyrocketing while people are losing their paychecks.
Under traditional Keynesian theory, this simply wasn't supposed to be possible. High inflation was understood to be a symptom of an overheated, booming economy with too much demand. High unemployment and stagnation were supposed to cause prices to drop. Having both miseries at the exact same time broke the models. The Keynesians had no answer.
And this crisis kicked the door wide open for a fierce counter-revolution led by an economist from the University of Chicago named Milton Friedman and a school of thought called monetarism.
Friedman stepped up and delivered a direct, devastating challenge to the entire Keynesian establishment. His message was shockingly simple and bypassed the complex theories of aggregate demand entirely. He said the real problem isn't how we manage consumer spending. The real problem is how we manage the physical supply of money itself.
To the monetarists, inflation is not some mysterious, complex macroeconomic force driven by union wages or greedy corporations. It is pure, simple, undeniable mathematics. If you print too much money, every individual dollar in your wallet becomes worth a little bit less.
I want to introduce an analogy here from the breakdown to make this visceral. Think about making a large pot of soup for a dinner party. You have a pot with a certain amount of rich chicken broth flavor. Now suddenly 10 extra guests show up.
Okay, a soup analogy.
If you just take a pitcher of water from the sink and pour it into the pot to make the soup stretch further, you aren't actually creating more food. You are just diluting the flavor that was already there. Every spoonful becomes weaker and less satisfying.
Oh, I see.
When the government prints more paper money without the economy actually producing more physical goods, they are just pouring water into the economic soup.
Friedman famously summed this up in one undeniable maxim that is still quoted constantly today. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. If the price of bread, cars, and housing are all going up simultaneously across the board, it is not because bakers and car dealers suddenly got greedier. It is simply because the central bank printed too much money, and now there are too many dollars chasing too few goods.
And Friedman didn't stop there. He took aim directly at the Keynesian obsession with having the government fine-tune the economy by constantly adjusting spending and taxes to smooth out the bumps. He argued that the government is inherently structurally clumsy.
Because of the lag time, right? Let's say a recession starts today. It takes the government 6 months just to collect the data to realize we are in a recession. Then it takes Congress another year of arguing to pass a stimulus bill.
Then it takes another year for that money to actually be spent on building a highway. By the time the government medicine arrives, the recession might have already cured itself naturally, and injecting billions of dollars now will just cause massive inflation.
Friedman compared the Keynesian approach to a driver trying to steer a car down a winding road while only looking in the rearview mirror. Because the data is always old, you are always reacting to where you were, not where you're going, which means you will constantly oversteer, swerve, and eventually crash the car.
So Friedman's solution was radical in its simplicity. Take the steering wheel away from the politicians entirely. Instead of fancy Keynesian policies and massive spending sprees to fight unemployment, he advocated for a strict unbending rule. Just put the central bank on autopilot.
Just increase the money supply by a small, steady, predictable amount every single year, say 3%, to match the natural growth of the economy, and then do nothing else.
The monetarists also introduced a sobering, almost fatalistic concept called the natural rate of unemployment. They argued that in any dynamic, changing, free economy, there will always be a baseline level of joblessness. It is unavoidable. People switch careers, old industries die, new ones are born, and people move cities. It's a healthy churn.
And if the government tries to aggressively push unemployment below that natural baseline, by pumping the economy full of stimulus money, it won't create lasting prosperity. It will just trigger massive inflation, leading right back to stagflation.
The monetarist prescription was harsh but clear. Keep the money supply incredibly stable. Let the free markets work and get the government out of the way.
And this intense anti-interventionist sentiment didn't stop with just controlling the money supply. As we moved out of the 1970s and into the 1980s, this philosophy evolved into a direct attack on the tax code itself. This brings us to the era of supply-side economics.
Yes. The 1980s, the era of Ronald Reagan, Wall Street, and trickle-down economics. While the Keynesians were hyper-focused on boosting consumer demand, the supply-siders looked at the stagflation of the 70s and said, you are looking at the wrong side of the equation. Stop worrying about demand. People always demand things.
Right.
Focus entirely on production. Focus on the supply. If you make it easier and more rewarding to produce goods, the rest of the economy will naturally flourish.
The central thesis of supply-side theory is that high taxes and heavy burdensome government regulations act as a massive wet blanket on human ambition and productivity. They actively discourage people from working hard, innovating, and taking the risks necessary to build businesses.
Put yourself in the shoes of a highly skilled surgeon or a successful business owner in the late 1970s. You are thinking about taking on extra shifts or expanding your factory to build more products. But then you look at the marginal tax rate, and you realize the government is going to take 70% or sometimes even 80% of those additional earnings in taxes.
Well, at 80%.
You do the math and say, why would I work weekends and take on all this stress if I only get to keep 20 cents of every extra dollar? The incentive to produce extra value for society is completely destroyed.
So the supply side solution is aggressive, drastically cut taxes, particularly on corporations and high earners and slash regulations. The psychological theory is that if you let the most productive members of society keep more of their own money, they won't just hoard it. They will unleash a tidal wave of new investment, build new factories, innovate new technologies, and work harder, which expands the total capacity of the economy.
And this leads us to the most famous and perhaps most fiercely debated concept of this entire era, the Laffer curve. The legend goes that an economist named Arthur Laffer drew this curve on a napkin during a dinner meeting with politicians.
A literal napkin.
A napkin! The Laffer curve illustrates a paradoxical, almost magical idea that if tax rates are currently too high, cutting those tax rates can actually lead to the government collecting more total tax revenue.
It sounds like a paradox, but let's walk through the extreme logic of it. If a government sets the tax rate at 100%, nobody goes to work, because why work for free? The economy stops and the government collects $0.
Right.
If the tax rate is 0%, people work incredibly hard, but the government obviously collects $0. Therefore, somewhere in the middle, there is an optimal peak point of taxation. The supply-siders argued that in the 1970s, America was on the wrong side of the curve. Taxes were so high they were suffocating growth.
They argued that by cutting the rates, the economy would grow so rapidly that taking a smaller percentage slice of a massively larger economic pie would result in more total dollars flowing into the treasury.
And this pairs directly with the colloquial concept of trickle-down effects. The idea is that when you give massive tax breaks to the wealthy and to large corporations, you aren't just helping the rich, you are helping everyone. Because the wealthy use that extra capital to invest, create jobs, and water flows downhill to everyone.
Now, we promised at the beginning to remain impartial, and this is where the historical debate becomes incredibly fierce. We must look at both sides of the outcome of these policies in the 1980s.
Right.
It is an undeniable historical fact that these supply-side tax cuts coincided with a massive economic boom, a surge in GDP growth, and a crushing of the inflation that plagued the 70s. The economy absolutely took off.
Yes, the stock market roared. But critics of supply-side economics point to the darker side of the ledger. They point out that this era also coincided with drastically growing federal deficits and a severe, lasting widening of wealth inequality. The critics argue forcefully that the famous 1981 tax cuts emphatically did not pay for themselves with explosive growth as the Laffer curve promised.
In fact, the national debt grew so alarmingly fast that President Reagan actually had to quietly reverse course and raise certain taxes in 1982 to stop the financial bleeding.
To the critics, this proves that trickle-down is a fundamentally flawed, self-serving theory that primarily enriches the wealthy at the expense of the national debt, leaving the middle class behind.
However, supporters of supply-side economics look at the exact same era and argue that the initial tax rates of the 70s were simply so punitive that they had to be slashed to restore America's economic dynamism. And they blame the massive deficits not on the tax cuts, but on runaway government spending, particularly on the military, which outpaced the revenue growth.
So what does this all mean? We've gone from managing demand to managing money to managing taxes, but doesn't this all assume the basic plumbing of a country actually works? Whether it's the classical perfect competition or the supply-side tax cuts, they all seem to assume that you have honest courts, politicians who aren't corrupt, and perfectly rational humans making the decisions.
And that, it turns out, is a massive, fatal assumption. Because when you take these beautiful, elegant mathematical models off the chalkboard and you drop them into the messy, corrupt, unpredictable, highly emotional real world, those assumptions fall apart spectacularly.
Which brings us to a massive reality check. We are entering the realm of new institutional economics, public choice theory, and behavioral economics. These schools of thought looked at all the previous theories and essentially said, you guys are living in a fantasy world. You are entirely ignoring friction, you are ignoring political corruption, and you are ignoring human psychology.
Let's start with new institutional economics, or NIE. Founded by thinkers like Ronald Coase and Douglas North, if traditional neoclassical economics views the free market as a perfectly frictionless machine, where buyers and sellers instantly find each other and trade, NIE steps in and reminds us that in the real world, literally every single transaction involves intense friction. They call this friction transaction costs.
I want to use a practical example to explain just how paralyzing transaction costs can be. Imagine you want to shoot a massive feature film. You need cameras, actors, sets, lighting. But You are a hardcore free market purist. You don't want to create a production company. You don't want to form a corporation. You just want to use the pure, frictionless free market to hire everyone independently for exactly what you need, minute by minute.
Oh, that would be a nightmare.
Exactly.
Hmm.
If you rely purely on individual market transactions, the nightmare begins immediately. You would have to go out and personally negotiate a unique, legally binding contract with every single person involved.
You have to negotiate an hourly rate with the lead actor, but also with the person holding the boom mic, the person catering the lunch, the person driving the equipment truck. You would have to negotiate every single daily decision, manage the legal liability of hundreds of independent contractors, and haggle over every detail.
The legal fees, the arguments over minor breaches of contract, and the sheer time spent just drafting the paperwork would completely bankrupt the production before you ever rolled a single frame of film. The friction of the market is simply too high.
Exactly. And this simple realization answers one of the most profound questions in economics. Why do companies even exist? If free markets are so perfectly efficient at allocating resources, why do we form large hierarchical corporations with bosses and salaries and departments? Why don't we just contract everything out every day?
And NIE answers that we create institutions like corporations, like legal systems, like clear property rights, specifically to reduce these transaction costs. Institutions are the grease that makes complex economic projects possible. They replace thousands of daily market negotiations with a steady salary and a clear chain of command.
NIE also introduces this fascinating, almost deterministic concept called path dependence. It's the idea that history matters immensely, and small decisions in the past lock you into a path for the future. Take Silicon Valley. Why is Silicon Valley the undisputed king of the global tech industry? It's not because the physical dirt in California is magically better for growing computer chips.
Right.
It's because decades ago, a specific set of institutions happened to form there. You had Stanford University churning out engineers, you had early military defense contracts injecting capital, and you developed a unique legal culture that favored venture capital and risk-taking.
Once that path was set, it created an inescapable gravity. It pulled all the best talent and all the money toward it. Even if another city today passes better tax laws, they can't easily replicate that dense web of historical institutions.
Path dependence tells us that a country's present economic state is heavily dictated by the institutional choices it made centuries ago.
So, NIE establishes that institutions, laws, and governments are vital to reduce friction and create prosperity. We need people to write the rules of the game. But that leads us directly into the next massive reality check, public choice theory. Because we have to ask the uncomfortable question, who exactly writes the rules of the game?
Politicians. And public choice theory asks a deeply cynical but mathematically sound question: what if we analyze the behavior of government using the exact same economic tools we use to analyze markets? What if politicians aren't angels?
This is where the romance of democracy takes a hit. Founded by James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, public choice applies the strict economic logic of the rational, self-interested actor directly to the political sphere. It forcefully challenges the high school civics notion that politicians and bureaucrats are selfless public servants who wake up every morning thinking only of the common good.
Public choice theorists argue that politicians are human beings. Therefore, they are rational actors pursuing their own self-interest, just like the baker baking the bread to get rich. Just as a business CEO seeks to maximize profit for their shareholders, a politician seeks to maximize votes and campaign donations to stay in power, and a government bureaucrat seeks to maximize their department's budget to increase their own prestige.
And when you view politics through this unsentimental mathematical lens, a lot of highly irrational, seemingly stupid government behavior suddenly makes perfect sense. They introduce a crucial concept to explain this called concentrated benefits and dispersed costs.
This is one of the most illuminating concepts we'll cover today. I want to talk about the sugar tariff, because this perfectly explains why terrible economic policies survive forever despite everyone hating them.
The sugar tariff, okay.
Let's say a politician proposes a new tariff on imported sugar to protect American jobs. This tariff will artificially raise the price of sugar across the entire country. For the average consumer, you, me, and everyone listening, this means the cost of our groceries goes up slightly. Maybe we pay an extra $20 a year for cereal and soda.
$20 a year. That is a highly dispersed cost. The pain of the tariff is spread incredibly thin across 300 million people.
Exactly. I am annoyed about it, sure. But am I going to take 3 days off work, buy an expensive plane ticket to Washington, D.C., print out picket signs, and march in the streets to protest a policy that costs me $20 a year?
Absolutely not. My rational choice is just to grumble and pay the extra 20 bucks. The cost of fighting it is higher than the cost of the tax.
But look at the other side of the equation. Look at the benefits. That exact same tariff might hand an extra $20 million in pure, uncompetitive profit to a small handful of domestic sugar-producing corporations. That is a highly concentrated benefit.
And you better believe those three shooter CEOs will hire an army of high-priced lobbyists, spend millions on campaign donations, and fight tooth and nail to make sure that tariff gets passed.
So the politician is sitting in their office. Their goal is to get reelected. They look out the window. They don't see millions of consumers protesting. They only see highly motivated lobbyists offering them campaign funds to pass the bill. So the rational politician listens to the loud, well-funded minority, and they ignore the silent, apathetic majority. The bad policy wins.
This dynamic repeats constantly in modern democracies. It explains bizarre farm subsidies. It explains incredibly complex tax loopholes that only benefit one industry. And it explains protectionist trade laws that hurt the overall economy. Public choice also exposes the reality of regulatory capture.
Oh, regulatory capture is fascinating. We generally assume that when the government creates a new regulatory agency, say an agency to regulate a new tech industry, it is to protect the consumers from corporate greed.
But public choice shows the grim reality. Over time, the massive corporations who are being regulated use their vast resources to slowly infiltrate and influence the regulatory agency itself. They lobby politicians, they offer lucrative jobs to regulators who leave the government, and they get industry insiders appointed to the oversight boards.
Eventually, the watchdogs turn into guard dogs for the industry. They use the complex government regulations as a moat to crush small startup competitors who can't afford the massive compliance costs. The regulation actually creates a monopoly.
When you lay it out like that, I have to ask, is it too cynical to view every politician just like a greedy CEO? Are there no public servants?
It is crucial to note that public choice theory isn't judging the morality of the politicians. It isn't explicitly saying they are evil people. It is simply applying the neoclassical rational actor model to the political sphere to see what happens.
It argues that the system itself selects for this behavior.
Right. If you put an absolute angel in a system that rewards catering to special interests with re-election, the angel will eventually have to compromise, or they will lose their next election to someone who is willing to play the game. The incentive structure dictates the outcome.
Which is why their solutions aren't about finding more moral politicians. They suggest mechanical solutions. They advocate for strict constitutional rules. They suggest sunset clauses, where new regulations automatically expire after 5 years unless Congress actively votes to renew them. They emphasize jurisdictional competition.
Exactly. But the final devastating blow to traditional economic modeling comes from behavioral economics. This school looks at the individual humans inside this whole complex system, you and me, and says, actually, we aren't even rational calculators in the first place. We are deeply flawed.
Yes. In the 1970s, two brilliant Israeli psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, completely upended the foundational assumption of human rationality. They gave birth to behavioral economics by running a series of ingenious experiments that proved human beings are not supercomputers optimizing utility.
We are actually walking bundles of cognitive biases, emotional impulses, and lazy mental shortcuts.
Traditional economics assumes we have perfect calculating power. Kahneman and Tversky introduced the concept of bounded rationality. We simply do not have the brain power, the energy, or the time to calculate the perfect mathematical outcome for every single choice we make in a day. Instead, we rely on heuristics, rules of thumb, that are often good enough for survival, but are mathematically deeply flawed.
And these flaws aren't random, they are incredibly predictable. Take the concept of loss aversion. Traditional neoclassical math says that the joy of unexpectedly finding a $100 bill on the sidewalk should be exactly equal to the pain of losing a $100 bill from your wallet. It's the exact same absolute value of money.
But psychologically, it isn't even close. Behavioral economics proves that humans feel the pain of a loss roughly twice as intensely as we feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
Which makes us highly irrational when it comes to taking risks, investing in the stock market, or selling our homes.
But I want to talk about the $5 driving example, because nothing captures our everyday weirdness perfectly like this. I want you, the listener, to put yourself in this scenario. Imagine you are at an electronics store about to buy a basic calculator for $15.
Okay, 15 bucks.
Just as you are about to pay, a friend walks up and says, "Hey, I just saw a store 20 minutes across town that has this exact same calculator on sale for $10. What do? Most people would put the calculator down, get in their car, and drive 20 minutes across town to save the $5.
It feels like a massive victory. You are saving a third of the total price. You feel like a savvy shopper.
But now, imagine a second scenario. You are buying a large flat-screen television for $500. You are at the register. The exact same friend walks up and says, "Hey, the store 20 minutes across town has this exact TV on sale for $495.
That's the exact same $5 savings.
Right. Are you going to leave the store and drive 20 minutes across town to save $5 on a $500 TV? Absolutely not. You wouldn't even consider it. You'd tell your friend it's not worth the hassle.
But economically, mathematically, it is the exact same calculation. In both scenarios, you are trading 20 minutes of your time for $5 in cash. The value of your time didn't change. The purchasing power of the $5 didn't change.
But the framing of the choice, the context of the larger purchase, completely altered your behavior.
Yeah.
Is entirely irrational, just like the psychology of pricing things at $9.99 instead of $10.
Oh, the $9.99 trick. We all know it's a penny difference, but our brains read left to right. We see the 9, and our bounded rationality subconsciously tricks us into feeling like the item is significantly cheaper.
Traditional economics just throws its hands up at this behavior. It cannot compute it in a supply and demand curve. But behavioral economics leans into it, and it leads to a very powerful, practical concept called the nudge. The theory goes, if we know that human beings are heavily influenced by cognitive biases in how choices are framed, we can subtly design the environment to help them make better decisions for themselves without actually taking away their freedom to choose.
The hotel towel example is a classic nudge that we've all experienced. A hotel wants to save massive amounts of money on laundry, and they want to be eco-friendly, so they put a little cardboard sign in the bathroom asking you to reuse your towel to save the environment. It works okay. A few people do it.
But behavioral economists came in and ran an experiment. They found that if you simply change the wording on the sign to say 80% of the guests who stayed in this exact room reused their towels, compliance absolutely skyrockets.
Because humans are deeply social creatures. We are heavily influenced by peer pressure and herd behavior. By tweaking the framing to trigger our desire to conform to a social norm, you nudge the behavior dramatically without forcing anyone to do anything.
So if institutions, human biases, and political structures are the true foundations, how do we use this knowledge to help the billions of people living in actual grinding poverty?
And that question brings us to our final stop, the field of development economics. This isn't just an academic exercise. This field looks at the actual globe and asks, why do some nations prosper or stay poor?
Development economics realizes that you can't just take a simple neoclassical model of supply and demand, parachute it into a developing nation, and expect miracles.
Through their research, development economists identified something deeply insidious called poverty traps. The farmer example is perfect for this. Imagine a subsistence farmer in a developing nation. This farmer is incredibly poor. Because they are poor, they cannot afford to buy modern chemical fertilizer. Because they can't buy fertilizer, their crop yields are painfully low.
And because their yields are so low, they can't save money for next year's fertilizer. The trap snaps shut. The poverty causes the low yield, and the low yield mathematically guarantees the future poverty. Multiply that across millions of people.
But the incredible news is that small, highly targeted interventions can shatter a poverty trap. A prime example is microfinance, pioneered by Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. He started giving out tiny microloans to unbanked entrepreneurs. That tiny capital allows a woman to buy a sewing machine, generate income, and permanently break out of the trap.
Another brilliant intervention involves conditional cash transfers, like Brazil's Bolsa Familia program. The government gives cash directly to impoverished mothers, but with a strict condition their children must attend school regularly.
It solves immediate poverty while attacking the long-term poverty trap. Or consider the impact of adding iodized salt. For literally pennies, fortifying the local salt supply with iodine boosts IQ and productivity across an entire population.
It shatters the myth that poor countries just need cash. Look at the comparison between Argentina and Singapore. A century ago, Argentina started rich with vast resources, but fell behind. Singapore started poor, a tiny swampy island, but prospered. Institutions, rule of law, and political stability matter exponentially more than raw resources in the ground.
Development economics ties the entire deep dive together. It borrows from all the previous theories. It requires the capital and trade of the classical schools, the institutional strength of NIE, the nudges of behavioral economics, and avoiding the political corruption warned about in Public Choice.
It's like trying to bake the bread from Adam Smith's bakery, but realizing the baker doesn't have an oven, the local politician is stealing the flour, and the recipe is written in a language they don't read. It proves economics isn't just academic chess. It is the engineering of human flourishing.
Exactly.
What an incredible journey we have been on today for you, the listener. From the grand machinery of classical and Marxian thought, down to the pizza slice decisions of neoclassical and game theory, through the crisis management of Keynes, Austrians, monetarists, and supply-siders, and finally into the messy reality of institutions, human biases, and global development. But I know you always like to leave us with the final provocative thought. What do you have for us today?
Well, think about this. If behavioral economics proves that we are fundamentally irrational, and new institutional economics shows that we rely on institutions to survive, while public choice theory warns that the politicians running those institutions are just acting in self-interest, is the ultimate invisible hand of the economy actually just human psychology playing out on a massive global scale? The economy isn't a machine out there. It's a mirror of us.
The economy is a mirror. I love that. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you are out in the world, spot these theories in the wild, whether buying a $9.99 item or watching the latest political debate. Keep questioning the world around you, and we will see you on the next deep dive.